We've made it to Module 10. This is the last module of the course, and in this video we're going to talk about different exercise environments that the athlete might encounter, so heat, cold, and altitude. Specifically, we're going to talk about exercise in the heat, temperature regulation, and how that's accomplished with exercise in the heat. We'll look at heat stress, how to keep ourselves hydrated during exercise even in hot environments. We'll talk about exercise in the cold, and finally we'll look at exercise at altitude and some of the adaptations that occur with exercise training at altitude. There are 4 modes of heat transfer that are pertinent to us as exercise physiologists. Evaporation uses heat energy to transform water from a liquid to a gas and is the most efficient form of cooling available to the body. Even if sweating is not visible, evaporation is occurring wherever body surfaces like the respiratory tract and the skin are exposed to the external environment. Conduction occurs through the transfer of heat energy between molecules that are adjacent to one another. To illustrate conduction, grab an object and hold it in your hand for a little while, or just simply put your hands on your desk. What happens is when you first grab that object, like this camera, it's cold. But as the heat exchanges between the hand and the object that you're holding for an extended period of time, that difference disappears. That's conduction. There was a transfer of heat. If we think about heat exchange through conduction between exposed skin and the air, not much heat is going to be exchanged between the adjacent molecules. Conduction happens to be an ineffective method of losing heat into the air, but if you're submerged in water, that water is going to have a higher thermal conductivity, thus you'll lose heat much more rapidly. It's important to note that hypothermia, that is body temperature that goes lower than 37 degrees Celsius, is actually accelerated when you're submerged in water. And this will happen even if the person feels like the water temperature is really comfortable and they could stay in for a long period of time. Convection occurs when air or water next to the body is heated by conduction and then moved away. The heat loss is going to be a function of the velocity of the movement of the air or water around the body. Convection happens to be a much more effective way to cool the body than conduction by itself. In research studies where people are working in a very hot and uncomfortable work environment, if we add fans to circulate the air, that actually increases the heat dissipation and can increase worker productivity. As a side note, the wind chill index actually combines the wind speed with the ambient temperature to give us a hypothetical temperature at which there is no wind movement at all. For example, if the wind speed is 25 miles per hour at a temperature of 30 degrees Fahrenheit, that would produce a wind chill factor of 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So it gives us a way to standardize the air temperature with no wind movement. Radiation is energy in the form of electromagnetic waves. Our bodies and all the objects around us in the environment emit radiation. The rate at which heat is gained or lost depends on the temperature difference between your body in that environment and the average for all the objects in the surrounding environment. If the environment that you're in is warmer than you are, you'll absorb the energy in the form of radiant heat. If your surrounding environment is cooler than you are, you'll actually lose energy in the form of radiant heat. The greatest source of radiant heat is the sun. The amount of radiant heat that we absorb from the sun really depends upon the surface area of the skin exposed to the sun and the angle at which the sun's rays are hitting the body. For example, if we decide to go to the beach and we're in a swimsuit and we're laying on the beach around noontime, we're going to absorb the most radiant heat at that time. If we choose to exercise outdoors when we're exposed to the sun, it's highly advisable to wear light-colored clothing because that will absorb less radiant heat than darker clothing. This slide shows us how great the human body is at regulating core body temperature. The human body has evolved to operate optimally at or near our regulated body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius. This is the body temperature that chemical reactions work at their best. Core body temperature in humans is maintained at or near this set point of 37 degrees Celsius over a wide range of ambient temperatures, demonstrating how effective the heat-conserving and heat-dissipating mechanisms are. In this diagram on the y-axis we have core body temperature in degrees Celsius, and on the x-axis we have ambient temperature in degrees Celsius. The efficiency with which skeletal muscle uses energy, that is ATP, to produce work is actually pretty low. the highest theoretical efficiency in converting chemical to mechanical energy, that is, converting the release of chemical energy from the hydrolysis of ATP to actual sarcomere shortening to contract the muscle, is about 35%. That is to say that only 35% of the energy that's provided by the hydrolysis of ATP, that is the breaking apart of ATP, is used to perform actual mechanical work. The rest is given off as heat, so 65% is going to be given off as heat. When we take into account various constraints that are imposed on skeletal muscle by the arrangement of bony levers and the differences in muscle length, force-velocity relationships, etc., the actual efficiency during most movements is going to be even lower, perhaps even as low as 5 to 15%. So in other words, the hydrolysis of ATP is going to release anywhere between 85 to 95% heat. So we're only utilizing a very small amount of that chemical energy to produce mechanical work, that is the shortening of the sarcomere so that the muscles can contract. If you consider that skeletal muscle mass comprises about 40% of our overall body weight, that poses a large problem of how do we deal with all of this internal heat production during exercise. Not only that, as we increase the intensity of exercise, the overall amount of heat that's produced also increases. So unless that's dissipated, it's going to be stored internally in the body, which of course is going to increase core body temperature. And let's not forget, if we exercise in a hot and humid environment, those problems are going to be exacerbated. During heavy exercise in hot environments, it's not unusual for core body temperature to reach 40 degrees Celsius and skeletal muscle temperatures to reach 41 to 42 degrees Celsius. Those kinds of temperatures present a problem because that's where we start to see protein degradation. At a temperature of 43 degrees Celsius, we'll start to see the beginning of protein degradation. So you can see that it's really critical as exercise physiologists that we identify all of the early signs of a heat illness, and really critical that we lower that person's body temperature. So the take-home message from this slide is that the human body does a really great job at regulating core body temperature such that it maintains that body temperature at or around 37 degrees Celsius, because again, this is where all chemical reactions work their best at. This illustration shows us how the temperature regulating feedback mechanisms work in the human body. There are peripheral sensors in the skin as well as sensors in the core of the body. These are continually providing feedback about the external and internal environments to the integration centers in the hypothalamus and the spinal cord. This then results in mechanisms that allow to increase or decrease body temperature to get that temperature as close as possible to 37 degrees Celsius. So when the environment is hot, the body responds with strategies to maximize heat dissipation. Conversely, when the environment is cold, the body automatically minimizes the amount of heat that we're losing. Exercise in the heat is a really important topic to us as exercise physiologists. Heat illnesses are number 2 as far as what kills athletes, only second to head injuries. So you can see that it's really important that we understand how do we prevent heat illnesses so that we can minimize the risk to the athlete when they're exercising in a hot and humid environment. So let's take a look at conservation and dissipation of body heat. Skin blood vessels are going to vasoconstrict under cold environmental conditions to keep blood in the core of the body and conserve heat. Under hot conditions, the skin blood vessels are going to dilate in an attempt to dissipate the body heat. This decrease in central blood volume decreases preload, which lowers stroke volume and causes an increase in heart rate. At any level of submaximal exercise in the heat, the heart is going to be working at a higher percentage of maximum than under thermoneutral conditions. An easy way to recall how skin blood flow is affected in cool or hot environments is to think of a large inner shell and a small outer shell when blood flow is diverted to the center of the body, and a small inner shell and large outer shell when skin blood flow increases to dissipate heat. Directing blood to the periphery in an attempt to stabilize core body temperature has a tremendous effect on exercise performance, largely because of the decrease in the central blood volume and a concomitant reduction in ventricular preload. So if we look at the core adjustments during exercise in the heat, what we're going to find is that we get a decrease in central venous pressure because of the decrease in central blood volume, which decreases stroke volume. There actually isn't going to be a change in cardiac output because remember, we can increase heart rate. This also decreases arterial blood pressure. When we look at blood flow to the splanchnic area, that is the gastrointestinal tract, we're going to have a reduction in blood flow there, as well as an overall reduction in blood volume. There will also be reduced blood flow to the kidneys, as well as skeletal muscles. The reduction in overall blood flow and blood volume to this inner shell allows for an increase of blood volume to go to the outer shell. We have an increase in skin blood flow as well as an increase in skin blood volume. It's important to remember from our previous lecture in cardiac physiology that there's going to be competition for blood flow. When we exercise in the heat, this competition is going to be exacerbated and is going to affect both preload and afterload. If you recall, 90% of cardiac output in a conditioned athlete exercising at maximum levels is going to be delivered to the contracting skeletal muscles. This is accomplished by vasoconstriction so that we divert blood flow away from non-essential organs so that we can redistribute that blood flow to the contracting skeletal muscle. Let's use this diagram to take a look at these changes in skin blood flow more carefully. On the y-axis we have skin blood flow, and on the x-axis we have core body temperature in degrees Celsius. The green line represents resting conditions, and the red line represents exercising conditions. So take a look at skin blood flow at rest at core body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius. It sits at about 7 milliliters per 100 grams per minute. During exercise with core body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius, skin blood flow is actually lower. This means that heat regulation really isn't a problem during exercise. The skin blood vessels are going to be constricted and blood flow to the skin is going to be quite low. As exercise continues, skin blood flow is actually going to rise at a much slower rate compared with the resting condition. This highlights the competition that exists for blood flow between the skin versus the contracting skeletal muscle. When core body temperature starts to increase under resting conditions, skin blood flow is also going to rise more rapidly, which results in a very effective heat transfer from the core to the periphery. So at the beginning of exercise, when there's no thermal stress that's present, skin blood flow is actually going to initially decrease. However, if core body temperature begins to rise as exercise progresses, then skin blood flow will increase, but at a much slower rate than at rest. The blood vessels in skin actually can accommodate up to about 30% of the total cardiac output. So any significant diversion of blood from the core to the skin is actually going to cause a reduction in central blood volume, which of course then is going to adversely affect stroke volume. As you recall, that cardiac output is really necessary to deliver oxygen to meet the demands of the contracting skeletal muscle fibers. If we reduce stroke volume, then of course we have to increase heart rate in order to maintain a given level of cardiac output. This causes the exerciser to work at a higher percentage of his or her heart rate reserve. All of this is exacerbated if exercise is already beginning in a very hot and humid environment, which means that the body is already thermoregulating to mitigate the heat production. To summarize, if you begin exercise in the heat, stroke volume is already going to be lower and heart rate is going to be increased. If the environment is hot, the athlete is already automatically going to have a reduction in stroke volume and an increase in heart rate, even before exercise. If you add exercise, then you're going to increase heat production, which is going to cause a diversion of blood to the periphery, which further decreases stroke volume. This forces the cardiovascular system to work at its limits in terms of submaximal oxygen consumption. If the heat stress continues because exercise continues in this hot environment, more and more blood is going to be sent to the skin in order to try and dissipate that heat. The consequence of this is TPR is going to be lowered and blood pressure is going to drop. This might cause the exerciser to feel dizzy or disoriented, which are the hallmarks of a thermal imbalance. In this diagram, we're going to talk about cardiovascular drift. On the y-axis, we have the 10-minute value as a percent of all the variables that you see listed here by the different colored lines. There's heart rate, VO2 difference, oxygen uptake, cardiac output, blood volume, arterial pressure, pulmonary arterial pressure, and stroke volume. On the x-axis, we have exercise time in minutes. During prolonged steady-state exercise in a thermally neutral environment, that is, there is no exchange of heat between the environment and the human body, core temperature will rise slowly, which results in an elevated skin blood flow. The central venous pressure will begin to drop, which lowers ventricular preload. This, of course, causes a decrease in stroke volume. In order to maintain cardiac output, heart rate has to increase. With cardiovascular drift, we also see a decrease in systemic arterial pressure and an increase in oxygen consumption. The decrease in arterial blood pressure is to be expected, and we can easily explain this, but the increase in VO2 is really not that easy to explain. Given that this is steady state exercise, why does oxygen consumption increase? We're not increasing the exercise intensity, so oxygen consumption theoretically shouldn't increase. So why is this happening? If we look at the AVO2 difference, we see a steady increase in that difference, meaning that we've extracted more oxygen from systemic circulation. It's pretty apparent that the approximate 8% increase in VO2 after about 50 minutes of prolonged steady-state exercise is accounted for by the increase in extraction. But this can only partially explain why there's an increase in VO2. It's important to note that skin blood flow probably is increased during this model, even though there is no transfer of heat from the environment to the human body in this particular study. That increase in skin blood flow is probably coming from vasoconstriction of non-essential areas, as we've talked about in the past. So the increase in oxygen consumption is coming from several different areas. Number one, heart rate's increasing, so that is going to require more oxygen consumption by the myocardium. Two, as the core body temperature increases, that's actually going to stimulate an increase in minute ventilation, which of course, if we increase minute ventilation, we've got to also increase the amount of oxygen that the respiratory muscles are consuming to perform that work. Not to mention the fact that there's going to be more unloading of oxygen from hemoglobin. Thirdly, a core increase in body temperature also speeds up cellular processes that utilize ATP for energy needs. That's going to increase the metabolic costs as well as energy use. This is what we call the Q10 effect. Lastly, there's the uncoupling of oxidative phosphorylation. That is that relationship between oxygen and the production of energy in the electron transport chain that we saw with the NADHs as well as the FADHs, that transfer of electrons. That relationship falls apart and we produce less ATP. So normally we get about 3 ATP for every oxygen molecule. With an increase in core body temperature, now we're going to produce less than 3 ATP for every oxygen molecule that we consume. The bottom line is that we're going to consume more oxygen to produce the same amount of ATP. During exercise in a hot environment or during moderate to intense exercise in a thermal neutral condition, conduction, convection, and radiation are simply inadequate to balance the heat loss with the heat production. So our last mechanism that we have in place is to simply sweat. Sweat is going to contain varying concentrations of sodium chloride, potassium, urea, and lactic acid. On the right-hand side of the screen, we see a picture of a sweat gland and a sweat duct in the dermal and epidermal layers of the skin. The duct portion of the gland transports the sweat to the surface of the skin. When sweat moves slowly through the sweat duct, most of the sodium and potassium and water are going to be reabsorbed. However, if that sweat moves quickly through the sweat duct, lots of sodium and water are going to be lost. Someone who is not acclimated to exercising in the heat is going to lose a lot of sodium and water. However, as the person becomes acclimated to exercising in the heat, that sweat is going to have a much lower concentration of sodium. Acclimatization of the body to exercise in the heat is going to provide a more effective mechanism of cooling the body by sweating more but retaining more of the electrolyte sodium. Acclimatization is regulated by the amount of aldosterone that's secreted from the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys. This is going to stimulate the reabsorption of sweat as sweat is moving through the duct portion of the sweat gland. In order for sweat to be an effective cooling agent, it must evaporate. The amount of sweat that evaporates is dependent upon the amount of surface area that's exposed, so how much of our skin is exposed to the environment, the amount of convective air currents, or the wind speed, the temperature and humidity of the ambient air, with humidity being the most important factor. And of course, the overall amount of sweat on the skin is also going to affect the sweat rate. Relative humidity is the amount of water vapor pressure that's in the air. Warmer air tends to hold more water vapor, so if we increase the air temperature, we're probably going to increase the relative humidity as well, which means that less sweat is going to evaporate. At a high relative humidity, sweat's not going to evaporate at all and will simply just roll off our skin. This, of course, is going to reduce the effectiveness of this mechanism to cool the body and can become really dangerous for us. To determine whether or not an environment is safe to exercise in, take the ambient air temperature in degrees Fahrenheit and add that to the relative humidity. If that combined number is less than 140, then it's relatively safe, assuming proper hydration. If the number is between 140 and 160, then you want to take additional precautions and make sure you have a proper hydration plan in place. If the value is greater than 160, then you really want to consider postponing or avoiding exercise in that particular environment. Profuse sweating in a heat acclimatized person can result in the loss of body water at a rate of up to 2 to 3 liters per hour. Non-acclimatized people can produce about half that amount. If this water isn't replaced, the person can become severely dehydrated in just a short period of time. A loss of 1% body mass causes the thirst mechanism to kick in, but it's going to be delayed. We can't rely on the thirst mechanism to promote the consumption of fluids. If this loss extends to 7% of body mass, then we're going to see permanent cell damage or even death. During team sports like football, hockey, lacrosse, etc., it's not uncommon to see a 5% loss of body mass. This is why rehydration is really important. We need to practice a fluid consumption plan and take fluids in at regular intervals. We should be consuming small amounts of sodium, potassium, or glucose. Something like Gatorade is perfect for rehydrating in these types of sports. The recommendations are to enter exercise or participation in sport already hydrated, so euhydration. Prior to exercising, we should consume about 200 to 300 milliliters of fluid. And then every 15 to 20 minutes, we take in an additional 150 to 350 milliliters. A general rule of thumb is that for every pound that we lose in body weight, we should consume about 2 cups of fluid. That's about 480 milliliters. In children, rehydration is especially important because children don't drink enough even when they are thirsty. So they need to be instructed to regularly consume fluid in order to prevent dehydration. It's also noteworthy that a child's core body temperature will rise at a greater rate than an adult's at any given level of hypohydration. This brings us to the last point with dehydration, and that is if we drink large amounts of water in a very short period of time, that's actually not the best way to replace body water that's been lost. Why is this? If, for example, you decide to drink an entire liter of fluid, what's going to happen is the body is going to absorb all that fluid and then see that as a volume overload. So the kidneys then are going to process that volume by excreting all of that fluid that you just drank. It's better to rehydrate slowly over a period of time rather than to drink a very, very large volume. When we drink large volumes of fluid, what that does is that lowers the concentration of sodium in the blood. The lower concentration of sodium in the blood because of the fluid overload is going to make the thirst mechanism basically disappear because sodium is what drives the hypothalamus to tell us to drink more fluid. One of the first things that happens with being overheated, that is the temperature regulating mechanisms actually fail to keep us cool, is heat cramps. This is where we have a spasm in the muscle groups that are utilized during exercise. It's related to the loss of sodium, potassium, and water, and possibly due to a disruption in calcium homeostasis. Historically, one of the things that we used to give athletes who were prone to heat cramps were salt tablets. The theory was that the cramping was due to an excessive loss of sodium chloride in sweat. However, this practice is now contraindicated because salt is going to be rapidly absorbed into the bloodstream and that increases osmotic pressure. In order to balance the hyperconcentration of this sodium now that's in the blood, water is going to be pulled out of interstitial spaces, that is fluid between cells, as well as coming from cells. That's only going to exacerbate the tissue dehydration that's already present. So it's not recommended that you provide athletes or people exercising the heat with salt tablets. That's contraindicated. As dehydration increases, we now go from heat cramps to heat exhaustion. This increases in the severity of the symptoms that we're going to experience. Heat exhaustion is where cardiac output cannot meet the demands of both the increase in skin blood flow as well as the increase of blood flow demand to the skeletal muscle. With heat exhaustion, the rate of heat loss from the body does not keep up with the heat gain. The symptoms include a drop in blood pressure, tachycardia, dizziness, and profuse sweating. The person also may become lightheaded or dizzy and become disoriented. If an exerciser or athlete manifests the symptoms of heat exhaustion, the activity should be immediately stopped, and that person should lie down in a cool place. Additionally, we should replace fluids with some sort of electrolyte drink. As dehydration progresses, that could lead to heat stroke. This is second only to head injuries in exercise-related deaths. This is a major medical emergency. This is where we have a complete failure of the heat-regulating control centers in the brain, which causes an explosive rise in body temperature. Symptoms are going to include hot, dry, red skin. There's going to be extreme confusion or disorientation, and even possibly convulsions and unconsciousness. Immediate intervention is critical. We've got to lower that core body temperature. This can be done with placing ice packs on the groin, the axillae, and neck, or with immersion in slightly warm water. Because protein degradation and cell membrane permeability is altered, there's going to be a lot of protein circulating in blood, which can cause permanent kidney or liver damage. Furthermore, those who do survive a heat stroke are much more susceptible than others in the future to heat-related illnesses, most likely because of malfunctioning sweat glands that lead to a reduced ability to cool the body through sweating. It's important to remember that heat illnesses are most commonly observed out on the athletic playing fields, especially during practices that are held under hot and humid conditions, and in particular during activities that involve high school or younger athletes. In this diagram, we're going to look at acclimatization to heat. We have three y-axes here. The one on the left is rectal temperature in degrees Celsius. That's represented in green. The one in the middle is sweat loss, that's represented in red, and the one on the right is heart rate in beats per minute, that's in yellow. And on the x-axis, we have exercise for 100 minutes every day in the heat for 9 days. An increase in the sweat rate is accompanied by a lower threshold for the onset of sweating. Both of these changes reduce the need to increase skin blood flow circulation as a means of cooling the body. This is going to preserve central blood volume, which means that we're going to maintain stroke volume without having to increase heart rate to compensate for a reduction in stroke volume. We have a much better distribution of sweat over the surface of the body, which also aids in heat dissipation and reduces skin blood flow. Acclimatization also brings about an increase in the secretion of antidiuretic hormone, or ADH for short, and aldosterone. The ADH is going to increase body fluids through a decrease in urine production, which is going to facilitate an increase in sweat production and an increase in plasma volume. Aldosterone is going to reduce the sodium chloride loss in spite of the higher sweat rate. This greater reabsorption of sodium chloride occurs in the duct portion of the sweat gland and is essential in helping to maintain tissue electrolyte balance during exercise in the heat. Thus, a heat acclimatized person has a lower heart rate and higher stroke volume as compared to an unacclimatized person at any level of submaximal exercise in the heat. This, of course, is going to lower stress on the cardiovascular system and produce less fatigue and lower perceived exertion. Now let's shift gears and talk about exercise in the cold. During exercise in the cold, we actually have a reduction in skin blood flow. This means we get a shift from blood at the periphery to that inner shell that we talked about earlier. This is because the sympathetic nervous system causes peripheral vasoconstriction. We also get a decrease in lipid mobilization from adipocytes because there's a decrease in blood flow to fat cells. This shift in blood flow is going to cause an increase in the amount of skeletal muscle glycogen that we use because we're relying more on carbohydrate metabolism versus lipid metabolism. This is going to cause an increase in lactate production simply because we're relying more on carbohydrate use and we're actually clearing less lactate from the blood. We also get an increase in the central blood volume because there's more peripheral vasoconstriction that shifts that blood flow away from the skin to the central core. Since there's an increase in the central blood volume or central venous pressure, that means that stroke volume can be higher, which means that at any given submaximal exercise, our heart rate's going to be lower because we have a higher stroke volume and we can maintain a given level of cardiac output. That's all due to this increase in the central blood volume. We're also going to have a decrease in muscle strength and power because the cold is going to cause a decrease in enzymatic activity. And when we decrease enzymatic activity, remember that's going to change the rate of chemical reactions. We also get an increase in minute ventilation because of the increase in SNS activity. Let's talk about exercise at altitude. What is the problem? The problem is that there's a decrease in the overall pressure of oxygen. If you recall from the pulmonary lecture, ambient air has a partial pressure of oxygen of about 21%. At sea level, that corresponds to about 159 millimeters of mercury. Alveolar air at this level is about 147 millimeters of mercury. If we go to 10,000 feet, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is 107 millimeters of mercury. Continue on to 18,000 feet, that drops further to 80 millimeters of mercury. At Mount Everest, which sits at 29,000 feet, that's 8,900 meters, the ambient pressure of oxygen drops to 48 millimeters of mercury. That corresponds to an alveolar pressure of only 25 millimeters of mercury for oxygen. So you can see the problem here of a reduction in oxygen pressure. The problem of decreased oxygen pressure in the atmosphere as we increase in altitude is easily seen on this diagram on the left-hand side of the screen. On the y-axis, we have the pressure of oxygen in torr. It's just another way to express the pressure of oxygen. And on the x-axis, we have the pressure of inspired O2, alveolar pressure of O2, the arterial pressure of O2, and then the average venous pressure of O2. The yellow line represents the pressure of oxygen at sea level. The red line represents the pressure of oxygen at 4,300 meters. We can clearly see the difference in the pressure of oxygen as we increase in altitude. It's obviously going to be lower. Another noteworthy point here is that the venous pressure of oxygen between sea level and 4,300 meters is really not that much different. Obviously, the altitude, we're going to extract more oxygen because we're starting off with less, but however, they're relatively similar. The two graphs on the right-hand side of the screen explain the relationship between altitude and oxygen pressure. The top panel shows the relationship between altitude and inspired pressure of oxygen, as well as the alveolar oxygen pressure. On the y-axis, we have the oxygen pressure in millimeters of mercury, and on the x-axis, we have altitude in thousands of feet. The green line represents inspired pressure of oxygen. The blue line represents the alveolar pressure of oxygen. The lower panel shows the oxygen dissociation curve and its relationship to the effects of altitude. So on the y-axis, we have the percent arterial oxygen saturation of hemoglobin, and on the x-axis, we have the pressure of oxygen in millimeters of mercury. We also have various locations and the altitude that corresponds with the partial pressure of oxygen at that particular altitude. VO2 max is going to decrease about 3% per 30.5 meters or 100 feet of elevation, beginning at about 1,500 meters or 5,000 feet. For example, a person with a VO2 max of 50 milliliters per kilogram per minute at sea level is going to have an approximate VO2 max of 15 milliliters per kilogram per minute at the summit of Mount Everest. It's no surprise that climbers who make the sojourn to Mount Everest are going to rest after each step on the way up. Much of the interest in understanding physiological responses to high altitude training of athletes came about because of the 1968 Mexico Olympics. The altitude in Mexico City is approximately 2,300 meters or 7,500 feet. The long distance events were dominated by the athletes who lived and or trained at high altitude. Today, it's very common to use high altitude training to improve performance at lower altitudes. Acute mountain sickness typically happens when lowlanders flying in an airplane go to a destination that's at higher altitude. This typically happens 4 to 12 hours after arriving at the location that's at high altitude. People will vary in their response to altitude, but generally, most people will experience symptoms above 8,000 feet or about 2,500 meters. Severe cases of AMS are going to happen at about 2 of every 10,000 visitors to altitude. The symptoms include a headache, nausea, insomnia, general weakness, and a loss of appetite. Symptoms can disappear once the person becomes acclimated to the altitude. If an unacclimated person attempts to exercise at altitude, that could lead to high altitude pulmonary edema or HAPE. This happens 19 to 48 hours after a rapid ascent and results from the vasoconstriction of the pulmonary system, where now we have high pulmonary arterial pressures. That forces the accumulation of fluid in the lungs and in the brain. The subclinical manifestations of HAPE can result in a continuous cough and shortness of breath. High altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, develops in individuals with AMS after hours to days of exposure, and this is where you get an increase in the intracranial pressure. This is due to cerebral vasodilation that's coupled with an increase in capillary hydrostatic pressure. So we're going to have the movement of fluid and protein into the brain. Symptoms can be as mild as dizziness and a headache, but it can also lead to nausea and even vomiting, and in severe cases, a coma. The initial treatment of AMS entails reducing or eliminating the hypoxia somehow. Immediate treatment might include the administration of oxygen along with the object of moving the victim to a lower altitude as soon as possible. Diuretics can also reduce pulmonary edema. However, the best thing to do really is to ascend to altitude slowly and progressively, or by the administration of acetazolamide before the ascent. Acetazolamide is a drug that's going to inhibit the action of carbonic anhydrase in the kidney, which causes an increase in urinary excretion of sodium, potassium, and bicarbonate, and a decrease of excretion of ammonium. That's going to lead to a greater production of urine, so the loss of body water, and a lower blood pH, which helps offset the symptoms of high altitude pulmonary edema and high altitude cerebral edema. So let's take a look at the adjustments to a bout of acute exercise at altitude. We're going to get an increase in minute ventilation because of the hypoxia that occurs at high altitude. The lower arterial pressure of oxygen is going to stimulate the carotid receptors. This is going to increase minute ventilation, which results in hyperventilation. As you recall, the more that we breathe, the more alkaline the blood pH is going to become. That's going to reduce the stimulus to breathe. This is going to decrease the alveolar to capillary pressure gradient, which means now that we have less driving pressure, we have less diffusion of gas going from the lung to the blood. Heart rate is also going to increase because stroke volume is slightly decreased. This actually preserves submaximal exercise performance. As we've already discussed, the pulmonary vascular resistance is going to increase, which results in pulmonary hypertension. These tables show you the acute responses to exercise at sea level, so 0 meters, as well as 4,000 meters or 13,000 feet. There are varying levels of exercise intensity. 600 kilogram meters per minute is a lower intensity exercise. As you go to 900, that's moderate exercise, and of course, maximum exercise. I would encourage you to take a look at these numbers and see how oxygen consumption and minute ventilation and the arterial saturation of oxygen, as well as cardiac output, heart rate, stroke volume, and the VO2 difference as we increase exercise intensity, and compare those differences between sea level as well as altitude. So what happens if we exercise chronically at altitude? How do I become acclimated? What are the responses? What are the adaptations? We're going to maintain hyperventilation. That is, our minute ventilation is going to remain elevated or increased. This is due to the fact that the hypoxia is still stimulating the carotid receptors to breathe more. As you recall from your pulmonary lecture, when we increase minute ventilation, that is going to increase the alveolar pressure of oxygen, which increases the driving pressure so that we diffuse more gas from the lung into the blood. We'll also get an increase in bicarbonate excretion from the kidneys. This is going to decrease blood pH, which makes the blood more acidic and restores that drive to breathe more. Remember that carbon dioxide forces us to breathe more. If we have more carbon dioxide in the blood because there's less bicarbonate there to buffer that acid, that's going to increase minute ventilation. The hypoxia is also going to increase erythrocyte production and therefore the amount of hemoglobin on red blood cells. This, of course, is going to enhance the oxygen carrying ability of the blood. Interestingly, submaximal heart rate is going to remain elevated, stroke volume is still going to be decreased, and our cardiac output max is going to be decreased as well. This will still happen after about a week of exercising chronically at altitude. In extreme cases, we actually see physical changes to the lung. The upper limit for human habitation at altitude seems to be about 14,000 feet or 4,300 meters. In people who have lived in the Andes or Himalayas for years or even generations, you start to see some structural changes in the lung that have allowed these folks to adapt to live in these harsh environments where hypoxia is very prevalent. Some of these include increased muscle capillarization as well as an increase in myoglobin. There also seems to be a higher diffusion capacity from the increased surface area. The interesting thing is that the alveoli remain the same size, but there are actually more septae, so there's more divisions among the alveoli, and that promotes an increase in gas exchange. The chronic increases in hemoglobin and the oxygen carrying capacity of blood has led to the use of altitude training in an attempt to improve sea level performance. So let's take a look at this particular study to see if we can get an improvement in exercise performance by training at altitude. On the y-axis, we have VO2 max in liters per minute, and on the x-axis, we have the experimental days going from 0 to 45. The yellow line represents a group of individuals that trained at sea level first, and then at about day 20, they switched over and began training at altitude. Group 2 in red trained at altitude first, and then at about day 20, switched over and began training at sea level. So what happened? It's first important to note that VO2 max was similar in both of these groups. The individuals who were training at sea level didn't see a change in VO2 max for the first 20 days. However, when they went to altitude, as expected, their VO2 max dropped. Towards the end of the experiment, you can see that after training at altitude, their VO2 max came up to near pre-experiment levels. In group 2, you can see that training at altitude decreased their VO2 max. When they switched back over and trained at sea level, at day 20, you can see that their VO2 max from training at sea level resumed back to pre-experiment levels. So the take-home message from this particular study is that VO2 max is definitely lowered by training at altitude, but once you return to sea level, resumes to near baseline values. This raises the concern that training at altitude might not elicit enough of an exercise intensity to get improvements in VO2 max or even maintain exercise performance once you come back down to sea level. In this particular study, we have on the y-axis the maximal steady-state oxygen consumption, and on the x-axis we have the weeks of the study. We also have a lead-in time, training at sea level, as well as training at altitude. There were 3 groups of individuals in this particular study. The yellow line represents individuals who lived at high altitude but trained at low altitude. The red line represents those individuals who lived at high altitude and trained at high altitude. The green line represents those individuals who lived at low altitude and trained at low altitude. So what do these data suggest? These data suggest that I can increase my maximal steady state oxygen consumption, so therefore my exercise performance, if I live at high altitude but train at low altitude. Furthermore, I also get the added benefit of being able to exercise at a higher intensity at altitude. In this particular study, on the y-axes of both of these panels, we have the 5,000 meter time in minutes, so exercise performance for the 5,000 meter race, and on the x-axis we have the weeks of this particular study. The nice thing about this particular study is that this is in both men and women. And just as the previous diagram, the yellow line represents those individuals who lived at high altitude but came down and trained at low altitude. The red line represents those individuals who lived and trained at high altitude, and the green line represents those individuals living and training at low altitude. As we can see from these diagrams, there is a benefit to living at high altitude and training at low altitude. There's an improvement in exercise performance. The 5,000 meter time is less. So that means I can run 5,000 meters in less time than if I hadn't trained in this manner. The take-home message in all of these data is that if you want to take advantage of altitude as a tactic to improve exercise performance, you need to live high and train low. That is, we want to live at high altitude, but then come down to a low altitude to perform our training. The theory is that if we live at high altitude, we'll elicit an increase in red blood cell production and of course hemoglobin from the increase in release of erythropoietin or EPO from the kidney. And then if we couple that with training at low altitude, that will allow us to maintain our training intensity and oxygen consumption. This therefore then can improve exercise performance. It's important to note that some individuals are actually non-responders to this kind of training. As an exercise physiologist, you should be aware of the practice of blood doping. This can be accomplished by 2 ways. The first of which is where you take someone's blood that has had the adaptations of increased red blood cell production and hemoglobin production because they lived at high altitude or trained at high altitude. And you take that person's blood, you take some out, you freeze it, and then just before competition, you reinfuse that blood into the person's body. That artificially increases the oxygen carrying capacity of blood. The other way to do this is to administer EPO or erythropoietin. That's also going to have the same effect of increasing red blood cell production and hemoglobin availability, which artificially increases the oxygen carrying capacity of blood. Both of these practices are illegal and banned in sport, but they are very, very tempting for some athletes, and it's not unusual to hear athletes who are caught using these techniques in order to give themselves an advantage in terms of exercise performance.